I, for one, really enjoy Rachel's interviews. She exposes everything that is wrong with Disney with extreme confidence. The clowns who say that people are fake outraged by a princess film don't understand that it is bigger than Snow White or Rachel, who is clearly parroting what was said in the writer's room. It's about Disney, the destroyer of worlds. It's not often that someone says the quiet part out loud, which gives an insight into why their remakes have been such disasters.
I just mean that it's no longer 1937.
We're not intentionally, rebelliously turning it on its head. I just don't think that right now it's as effective a character for women because times have changed.
I mean, you know, the original cartoon came out in 1937, and very evidently so.
And I think it's like much more interesting to watch nowadays anyway. I don't think anyone would have wanted to root for somebody who was sweeping up a house and taking care of dwarves. I think you want to see someone become that perfect person, not have it so easy.
The cartoon was made 85 years ago.
These interviews make it abundantly clear that the people working at Disney simply do not understand the stories they are remaking and why they were popular in the first place. I absolutely love how they're shitting on the story that made Disney on the 100th anniversary of the company. It really shows the mindset of the people who work at Disney and how out of touch they are with the original values of the company. They also get bonus points because Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is the oldest surviving feature-length film using traditional animation, so they're shitting on history too. Snow White 1937 is outdated in many ways, but the arguments made in the interviews are utter bullshit. They're wrong on so many levels that it's as if they're making the original story look bad, almost evil, on purpose.
When we came to reimagining the actual role of Snow White, it became about the fairest of them all, meaning who is the most just and who can become a fantastic leader.
The first argument is about the updated meaning of the word fair. It sounds like a positive change if you don't think about it for more than 2 seconds. This so-called change is for me the most confusing part of the whole Snow White drama. If the fairest of them all isn't about beauty, then what is the mirror supposed to say to the queen? My queen, someone is fairer than you, but only according to the second definition of the word on Google. I mean, technically according to the first definition too, because let's be real here, they didn't cast an old ugly woman to play Snow White to make a point about inner beauty, so she's actually more beautiful and more just at the same time, but since beauty is outdated, let's pretend that she's only fairer on the inside than you, my queen. Every single person in the universe would be more just and a better leader than the queen. Unless the story is about who is the nicest woman, fair cannot mean two different things to the mirror at the same time, it's silly. So maybe she's talking about the moral of the story. The mirror talks about beauty, but the message is that looks are not the most important aspect of a woman. And that's where it gets even more confusing. That's what the story has always been about. Do they really think they came up with that themselves? Fairness has always had a double meaning with Snow White, because she's beautiful but she's also a very good person. It's the case in Little Snow White and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where the character who is nice and doesn't care about beauty triumphs over the evil character who is obsessed with her appearance. It's the case in Snow White and the Huntsman from 2012, where Snow White takes the sword and becomes a fantastic leader regardless of her looks, and the Queen's beauty is a visual representation of power and time.
In a way, I think when we look in the mirror and we start aging, we are naturally facing our immortality, and that's a scary thing. And for her, someone like her who has placed every ounce of her worth in what she looks like, it's 10 times worse.
The fairest of them all has always been more than a supermodel. It's a cautionary tale. So all I hear with this argument is that the 1937 version is the opposite of outdated because you're doing the exact same thing and you don't even realize it because you don't understand what the original story was about. Next, Rachel says,
It's extremely dated when it comes to the ideas of women being in roles of power and what a woman is fit for in the world.
Again, I'm confused. Snow White 1937 is not dated when it comes to the ideas of women being in roles of power, nor is it dated when it comes to the ideas of what a woman is fit for in the world, because the story is not about women and power. How can it be outdated if the movie makes no comment on it? There's two women in the story, Snow White and the Queen. The queen takes matters into her own hands after the hunter fails her. She's a woman in power, independent, clever, resourceful, and the master of her own fate. Sure, her motivation to be the most beautiful is a bit simplistic, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. It's a vehicle for more complex ideas like envy or mortality. The obsession with beauty is seen as wrong and leads to the death of the queen. So if anything, the film tells women that they should be more than pretty dolls, which sounds like a positive message to me. Snow White doesn't care about her looks, only the evil character does. In Snow White and the Huntsman, beauty is tied to power.
I replaced his queen, an old woman. And in time, I too would have been replaced. Men use women.
The queen got the job because of her looks, and once they fade, she'll be replaced by a younger model, and that's why she feels so threatened by Snow White. But the film doesn't just blame men, it also blames the queen. If you put all your worth in your looks, you will lose all your value when they fade. This is what we call a social commentary on the perceived value of women in society. In the original, beauty is not tied to power. The queen is not going to lose her job even if she's less attractive than Snow White. This is not what we call a social commentary on the perceived value of women in society. It's just a queen who happens to be the most beautiful and wants to stay that way. There's no hidden message or deeper meaning. The same goes for Snow White. There is no mention of what she's fit for in the world or her place as a woman. Again, the story isn't about a woman becoming a leader. Not all stories are about men wanting to be leaders. Not all stories are about women running for president. Snow White is a homeless person who found a job. The problem is that the people at Disney see a woman with a broom and they immediately assume that the film is telling women to clean the floor. But it's all in their heads. The film doesn't say what a woman should do at all. She's lost in the woods, all alone, in the Middle Ages. She's just trying to survive. Not everyone wants to fight. Not everyone can defend themselves. As far as we know, at the end of the film, she becomes a great leader and rules over the kingdom like her stepmother. Once again, the film doesn't tell women what to do, who to be, or how to use their power. Yes, the idea of women in positions of power has evolved. Yes, the story would be told differently if it were written today. Yes, the story has to be told differently in a remake because, as Rachel astutely pointed out, it's not 1937 anymore. But no, the story doesn't have an outdated message about women. Their issue is that the original doesn't fit the modern archetype of the strong female character. But just because you obsessively use the same archetype over and over and over again doesn't mean the others are bad.
And I think it's like much more interesting to watch nowadays anyway. I don't think anyone would have wanted to root for somebody who was sweeping up a house and taking care of dwarves. I think you want to see someone become that perfect person, not have it so easy.
Thank you, Kristen. You've successfully identified one of the reasons why Snow White is outdated without shitting on the original story or making up problems that don't exist. That's crazy. You understand that the 2012 version is a different approach to the story, that Snow White wasn't an action hero, and you're not trying to fix that mistake. What's outdated is the lack of character work and development, which has nothing to do with gender roles. Snow White doesn't have an agency problem, she's just passive like the prince. Think about it. What does the prince say about men? He's wandering around the forest, singing about true love. Is that what men are made for in this world? The reality is that the story can't say anything about gender roles because the character work is almost non-existent. She's waiting for her prince and he's looking for his princess. The dwarves are one man divided into 7. Grumpy is the only one with a decent arc, but he's too cartoonish to be a real person. So no, there's no problem with Snow White, because the film is not a multi-layered character study that will blow your mind. Nobody gave a shit about that at the time, and that's why it became the highest grossing film of all time on release. Movies are made differently now, and the original story doesn't live up to the expectations of modern storytelling. In fact, I've seen enough films from the 30s to say with confidence that Snow White was already outdated back then. Even silent films had more to say than Snow White, because Hollywood was already adapting novels, and the short story pales in comparison. Most of its success came from the use of color and innovative technology, a bit like Avatar. The film wasn't called Disney's Folly for nothing. 1939 winner, Walt Disney, for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, recognized as a significant screen innovation which has charmed millions and pioneered a great new entertainment field. No one ever said that Snow White was a Greek tragedy with profound social commentary. Context is important when criticizing a film. The last problem invented during the interviews concerns romance.
There is a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her. Yeah. Weird.
First of all, I don't understand why they keep calling Snow White a love story when it's clearly not. A kiss doesn't make it a love story, otherwise 89.5% of films are about love. She sings, he listens, they sing together for a minute. Flash forward to the end, the prince kisses her and they live happily ever after. How is that a love story? It is a story that happens to have love in it.
It's really not about the love story at all, which is really, really wonderful.
I fail to see how taking love out of the story is really wonderful. If you want to remove the romance, fine, but why are you acting like it automatically makes the story better? Love stories are not bad, only bad love stories are bad. Is it because love makes you dependent on someone and that's somehow a problem? Does it take away your agency? I think if you have to resort to such silly tricks to make your character seem independent, it means you don't know how to write someone who is independent.
That is
She's not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love.
Also, the fact that she's not going to be saved by the prince.
First, I fail to see how removing this from the story is fundamentally a good decision. If you want Snow White to save herself, fine, but why are you acting like it automatically makes the story better? Being saved by someone isn't bad, only bad rescue stories are bad.
We have a different approach to what I'm sure a lot of people will assume is a love story just because, like, we cast a guy in the movie.
It's almost as if this film isn't aimed at children, but at miserable people in their 30s. She's alive at the end because she's been good to the hunter, the prince, the animals, and the dwarves. The spell was broken by true love. So while the prince technically saved her, the story is a bit more complicated than that, and to imply that the prince is the hero of the story is disingenuous. The prince isn't even a man, he's a theme. The real problem with the ending is that she's not saved by a real character, but by the themes of love and friendship. And even then, I'd blame the genre rather than the story. That's why Disney's second animated feature, Pinocchio, has much more to say than Snow White. It's not a fairy tale. Little Snow White is a very simple story because the roots of the genre come from different oral stories passed down in European cultures. Nobody at the time was going to imagine and remember a long and complex story like Harry Potter and then ask people to sit down for 124 hours and 56 minutes. That's not how the genre works. It would take you less time to read Little Snow White than it would to listen to this entire video. And that's why we can't relate to the love story. Short fairy tales are not compatible with today's standards of storytelling. That's it. The original relies on one-dimensional characters and elements that are now considered tropes rather than compelling and grounded characters. If the prince had been a younger version of Grumpy, the love story would have been much more appealing. Taking away true love of the prince doesn't objectively improve the story. This shows a complete lack of understanding of the shortcomings of the original, and it shows that you're projecting your own insecurities onto the story. Also, the prince doesn't stalk Snow White. I don't know what movie you watched. The truth is that this story doesn't fit with Disney's current values and there's nothing inherently wrong with the original. This is a classic case of tearing down the past to elevate the present. The current year is only considered modern because it's the one we live in. We are not much better than the people who came before us, and in time we'll be outdated too. So let's try to be more humble about it. If the people who work at Disney could understand the story, they would realize that looking too much at themselves in the mirror will eventually lead to their downfall. To say that it's a remake of an 85-year-old story is pretty much wrong. This will actually be a remake of the 2012 film. Sure, it wasn't made by Disney, but let's face it, everything we've been told so far is a lot closer to Snow White and the Huntsman than the 1937 Disney version. The queen is a tragic villain. Snow White is a warrior princess. Snow White kills the evil queen and becomes the leader. The prince is not Snow White's true love. So this will be a remake of a very recent movie that has already subverted the original story, not a remake of an outdated 85-year-old film, which means you're not original, you're boring and lazy. Getting back to Disney as a company, these interviews show what is wrong with all these remakes, shitting on what people love and what came before to support their new product, making unnecessary changes based on made-up problems. trying to fix the story instead of improving it, sucking the fun and innocence out of the story in favor of a grounded and miserable approach. People are upset about the intentions behind the changes, branding the past and what they love as evil when it's clearly not. Snow White is not an isolated incident, it's a trend that can be seen in all of Disney's IPs. In conclusion, how can such tolerant people be so adamant about what is right and wrong?